Hey, what's up? It's Phoenix. Welcome to my channel. I hope you'll check out my other videos. I hope you'll check out my books, and thank you for watching. So I admit, I acknowledge, I don't know what I'm doing. I don't know why I do it. I don't know what it is that I'm looking for. I don't know what it is that I need. And of course, to an extent, I do know these things because I know what my goals are, and I know what I'm trying to achieve, and I know what I'm trying to do. Yet it seems to be that I find myself conflicted because there seems to be so much tension between what we think is the way things are and the way that things are, or tension between ourselves and the parts of ourselves that we ignore, and the tension between ourselves and the world around us. And it seems to me that in such days, it really is the notion of perplexity, where I acknowledge that I don't fully know what it is that I am experiencing. I don't know my own role in it. And it's really difficult because I think self-awareness can be a good tool. Because if you know yourself to some degree, know thyself as in the Socratic philosophies, then it makes sense that you would have that tool that can help you. But it seems to me that I find myself limited actually, not by the self-awareness, but by the lack of knowledge. And I don't know, I'm definitely pretty big on the fact that I think that we need the knowledge, but I realize despite how much I may understand about myself, I don't really understand a lot at all. And that's part of where the tension is. What are these sides of myself that I don't understand? And so internal family systems therapy can be an interesting way of looking at things that are going on. The firefighter, which is the one that puts out the fires, regardless of the cost in emergencies. The exiles, which are those parts of yourselves that are exiled and never talked to. And then there's also the manager who prevents you from getting close to people. And this, of course, is a very superficial understanding of IFS, but it's gotten me thinking about how I don't really know why I act the way that I do. If we take an evolutionary perspective, it makes sense, because while cooperation and cohesion among groups is so incredibly valuable for survival, we still operate and treat each other like individuals. And what that means is we have our brains and nervous system that are just trying to keep us alive. And it becomes complicated, of course, because it doesn't really make sense why that's what's happening, that we're trying to survive when we also have urges towards self-destruction or self-sabotage, when we have the death instinct, and all of these bizarre things that we think that we understand but that we don't. All of these bizarre aspects. But if you take an evolutionary perspective, you could say that that's the goal. It's trying to help us survive. But I think it gets conflicted because it's not always clear how to survive. We don't really understand our environments unless we're keyed into that understanding. We don't really understand the choices being made on a regular basis. We don't really understand entropy and how that impacts our lives. We don't really seem to understand anything. And the more that I think about it, the more I'm like, okay, so I know that I take this skeptical position, and I know that often I will be in perplexity because I just acknowledge that I don't know. But this seems to be an interesting thing that I've snagged upon, which is that how do I survive when I don't even know how to survive? How do I think about things when I don't actually know how to think about them? It becomes very meta in that way. And it's important to acknowledge that side of things because when you have a lack of knowledge, you're not going to know what to do. And so you have to accept that you don't have that knowledge and that there's nothing else that you can do, even though you still have to live somehow and figure out what you're doing. And so I've been puzzling on this a lot because you could take a lot of scientific perspectives on it, a perspective of this is why I act this way according to psychology or neurobiology or science. But it becomes complicated because you're still an individual and you're trying to make choices and you don't always have the knowledge. So what do you do when there's a gap there and you're not able to fill that gap? When there's a chasm of way too much emptiness that you can't even explain? And I often feel like this is one of the unfortunate things, is that there's so much information being communicated, and yet this information doesn't track. The information doesn't make any kind of sense or cross that barrier. And this is what I worry about, which is that the reality is we don't control that lack of crucial information being explained. And it can be incredibly complicated and kind of sad because there's so many things that we just don't know, and people suffer because of what they don't know. And it doesn't make sense. And yet that's the way that it is. They just do. Like when I take myself as an example, I think, how am I going to survive? How am I going to be able to live in this economy and be able to survive financially, especially when things happen the way that they do? That makes you feel as though you're not going to survive at all. I've got a mind that's actively trying to kill me every chance that it gets. I have a society that is indifferent and apathetic at the very least. And I find myself cut off, even though I don't know what to do with those severed connections. And it makes sense that there are a lot of models that show that cooperation is a big part to human survival. But what do you do when that is cut off, or when you're cut off from that and you find yourself isolated? Now, I'm lucky enough to where I have a lot of support. I think it's important to acknowledge that. And so I don't feel as though I'm like actually cut off or separated, at least completely. But I think it's understandable why we might feel that way. Because for me, I'm trying to find that knowledge. I'm trying to find a way of dealing with the world the way that it is. I guess it seems the best way that I can understand it, the best way that I can make sense of it, is that, okay, so I do have to do this on my own, even though there's a social contract that says that certain things will happen by parties that should honor that. But when they break that social contract, man, that is an unbelievable amount of pain that causes, an unbelievable amount of suffering. The most visceral example that I can think of in my own life, and a concrete example to illustrate this point, is that when they broke into my home, I still had to do my part. I still had to pay rent. I still had to find a place to live. I still had to be able to afford groceries, and I still had to work. How are you supposed to do all of that when your basic needs are being stolen from you and no one else will honor that? And so when people say that life's unfair, okay, yeah, life is unfair, but we don't even want to ask why it's unfair. We don't want to say any or suggest any reason why it's unfair because we actually are okay keeping things complacent, which means in the worst kind of logic, bad things can happen to you. And there's no recompense. There's no options. That's where the torment comes from as I look at my life and I think, okay, well, I've experienced all of these horrible things, and yet there's nothing I can do about them happening because I was literally at the mercy of other people. And that's pretty brutal because you spend your life trying to make the best choices you can, trying to balance your survival instincts and the things you need to do to survive, with trying to balance that with all of the other things that you feel and need to do. Being able to survive with your emotions and feelings. And it's a very conflicting message. And so I guess I just look at it from this perspective of like, how do you make sense of it? And I guess I don't really know. I think it's important that you try to explain it and that you try to make it what it is, but I've realized that I don't really know. And I guess I have to live with that. I'm Phoenix. I thought I would illustrate some of the conflict. I thought I would illustrate some of the mechanisms of my inner world. I don't really understand it because these things always seem justified. And even though I don't, thankfully, go into a defeatist mode, I still feel as though this is one of the most contradictory aspects of the world that we live in, is that we get stuck holding the bag. So yeah, I'm Phoenix. Thank you for watching. I hope to see you soon.